in HBCUs being white imperialism? Because that would be a strange kind of imperialism where you would teach African American students to think the way that you're right. And so we have to think about, how did HBCUs actually use the classics? Yeah. And did they use it as the white architects of African American education, or did they use them in a very different way? And so this sort of brings me to a close of my remarks and to think about how do we actually study HBCUs as sites of academic and intellectual excellence? It means that we got to really look at different kinds of questions, and we have to reframe it in a lot of ways. We have seen that, and I'd like to sum it up this way, in terms of three phases of African American history, as well as the history of African American education. There's sort of this phase when people looked at what was done to African Americans. And you saw that in the slavery studies. What was the impact of slavery? And studies on African American family and notions about the matriarchal family, or B. Franklin Fraser, on what was done to African Americans. And then there was the second phase. It was like, what was done for African Americans? What did the philanthropists do? What did others do for African Americans? And we moved into a phase now where the most important work is yet to be done, and that is the question of, what did African Americans do for themselves? And how did they do it? And what were their values? And what were their norms? And how did they accumulate over generations? We know there will be changes in HBCUs around a lot of these questions. It's transformative, it's dynamic. But at this point, we know snippets, and they are fragments. So for young scholars, it's going to be quite a rich field to really trace HBCUs from their formative years and look at issues of academic excellence, intellectual excellence, not only faculty-student relationships, but a critical part is student to students. A lot of work now, when it comes to students, they focus on sororities and fraternities and football games and things like that. They don't focus on academic excellence and intellectual excellence. And it's critical also to look at that in terms of student life and culture as well. Favor has this notion in this book. He called it the hidden curriculum. The second curriculum, he calls it, that there is this stated curriculum, there is this thing up front, but he's able to prove in his work that underneath all of that are relationships between faculty and students in HBCUs and relationships among students. That's the second curriculum that has much more to do with the ways in which their consciousness and their lives and their skills were shaped, at least as much as the formal curriculum. So I think that's the way to go, and I will close, and they probably will tell me where I've been wrong, and but anyway, I will stop here and see and let them take it from here. Okay.
Let's give Dr. Anderson another round of applause. I am Maurice Hobson, and I'm a graduate student of Dr. Anderson's. And one of the things that Dr. Anderson would say to us while we were training at the University of Illinois is to know is to have confidence. And so this is a major piece of that conversation. At this time, we will have responses to Dr. Anderson's papers by Drs. Hodge-Clark and Dr. Waite. We're going to ask Dr. Hodge-Clark to come up first and provide a response, and then we'll have Dr. Waite to respond as well.
Hi, good morning, everyone. How's everyone? What an incredible presentation. I'm just still awestruck right now in terms of really thinking about the centers of academic excellence that happen at HBCUs, and that piece that often doesn't get told. As someone who works for the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, and we do a lot of work with HBCUs, that is a thread that is often not there. We talk frequently about the problems, the challenges, what's wrong with this segment of institutions as the others on the periphery, as you say. And so I think there's much to be done and to learn there in that space. One thing that I was particularly struck or that resonated with me from Dr. Anderson's presentation was actually his note about a number of students who were curious as to, well, how were these students educated in the 60s and 70s? How did that come to be? And it brought me to the current moment in time with what we're seeing in a lot of institutions with activism on campus, and wondering, is now the time for HBCUs to really seize the moment? And so we know at a lot of the predominantly white institutions, students are now at the center of great debate with regard to freedom of speech issues on campus, campus climate-related matters, and yet we're seeing in states that the legislatures are saying, hey, now cut that out. We're now going to stifle your ability to assemble because you are, in a sense, saying that this controversial racist speaker shouldn't be on campus. And so I think about HBCUs as again, being in the prime time to say, hey, come on home. We can educate you on what's happening and take in this learning that you won't necessarily get at these other institutions. And so to do that, I also thought about it through the perspective of governing boards. And so what's their distinct role if we think about building this 21st century generation of young scholars and student activists and wanting them to come back to HBCUs? What do they need to do, and where are their challenges and opportunities for boards? And so in the work that we've done at the Association of Governing Boards, as I mentioned with HBCUs, we've looked at some of those challenges and new opportunities. And so the things for me that I think about are with regard to shared governance. And so the idea of shared governance being a huge opportunity. And so it relies on the board, the president, and the faculty to come together to make decisions about the future of the institution, about the types of learning that goes on, and about how do we engage our students. Because it's not just that students are protesting at these other institutions. Students are protesting at HBCUs too. Certainly we've seen at Bethune-Cookman, we've seen at Dillard University with David Duke and others. And so how can we, again, take those moments as institutions to really build this new cadre of young scholars? And so that being a big piece of, I think, where there's opportunities with trustees. I think, as I was mentioning to Dr. Anderson before we got started, another thing that's critical to HBCUs as well is with respect to the composition of their boards. And so we know that there continue to be opportunities with diversifying the board. And by diversifying, I don't necessarily mean along, we know a lot of the boards may have historical figures or those who have served for very long tenures on the board. And so now is the time to really think about how do we bring in new eyes, young scholars, many of whom, like ourselves, to kind of help think about the new direction for institutions, and again, how to engage this new generation of students. Certainly, as I was in the car ride over with Professor Kurita, we were talking about kind of the differences now on campus. I remember at Spelman, in the early 2000s, wow, it looks completely different now with the stepson who's in college and social media and all of that, and how different his experience is. And so what can be done, again, to leverage those moments and opportunities. The other piece as well that I think is huge here, and then I'll stop because I want to make sure we have enough time for everyone, is regarding leadership and succession planning at HBCUs. So we know there is an unfortunate trend that has emerged with significant turnover. The American Council on Education recently published their study, The American College Presidency. And so from that, we learned that I think the average tenure for presidents now is actually decreasing across the board from about 7 years to 6 years, but at HBCUs, that's about 3 years now. And so figure that's one contract. That's one contract term. And so imagine the limitations on being able to create change just with so much turnover. And so I think I see these as kind of contextual pieces in terms of how we think about creating sites of academic excellence, because we need leadership, we need strong, consistent leadership that funnels down into the faculty and builds these spaces. And so as we think about this topic, I want us to kind of keep that in mind. And so that's my comments for right now, and I look forward to discussion with the group.
I'm looking at Cynthia because she always wants me to be good. It doesn't work, but she's trying. or well-behaved, if she just said. So, hello, everyone. Many of you know me from my many different roles, but this is this really, for me, sort of amazing melding of my worlds, because I've known Jim Anderson since I was in graduate school. And I want to take a minute before I comment, and I could never tell him that he's wrong about anything, so you don't have to worry on that one. But I want to talk about the importance of this book, and I know that Vincent got at it a little bit. But this book was published, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1865 to 1930, was published in 1988, and it is still in publication, which is a tremendous thing, because it was a groundbreaking work. Until that point, everyone thought that blacks had been given their education through white largesse. And this was the first book that talked about black agency, the role that blacks played in their own education, in creating their own educational institutions and forging their own educational future. And the way in which they used social capital to build that, to be able to build these institutions. And so when we talk about work being seminal, we always say that this work was amazing. It still is. It has all of my students read it, the Summer Institute reads it, so I don't want us to forget that we heard these great remarks today, but this comes from a long piece, and I have had the privilege of learning how this book was produced. And, you know, it's a very interesting thing that archivists want to be like, well, there is no history of black education. So it was a battle to be able to do the research and be able to get that book done. So I want to talk about a couple of things in relationship to that. And that is that the historiography of black higher education is still wide, wide open. There is Jim's book, and there is a huge echo of silence since then. And one of the fears that I have is that we have swung the pendulum back to talking about what whites have done for blacks in terms of their education. And I think we have to be really careful. So when Jim says there's this wide open field, it is wide open, unbelievably. And there is sort of a rejection, a discomfort in thinking about black agency, in thinking about educational black agency. For a lot of publishers, for a lot of universities, it makes them very uncomfortable. Because HBCUs are an important part of American higher education as a whole. But as Jim said, he read all of the institutional histories. I bow to you. Because there's no comprehensive, the canonical work of higher education doesn't include HBCUs. Even to this day, Teach the History of Higher Education, it's one of those survey texts where there's one paragraph about HBCUs. And yet, their development parallels, in many ways, the development of all of the small denominational colleges that were established during the antebellum period, right? There's also this notion of HBCUs as only being Southern institutions, when the first HBCUs were in Pennsylvania, right, and Ohio. So there's so much left to be done. I say this to all the budding historians and all of those of you who are advisors who are historians. This field is ripe, and it is the perfect time to take advantage of it. So that's an important piece. But I want to come back to a couple of things that he said, and I know that Maurice will keep me on time. One of the things that goes along with that is this idea of why do we only know snippets of this history? And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm actually a total conspiracy theorist. But why do we only know snippets of this history? Whenever I teach a course on the history of African American, people are like, how come I never heard this? How come I've never heard of these institutions? How come, a man went to Spelman College? The first, right? And there's this desire to know more, but the historiography doesn't exist. And that's kind of what our job is now, is to take the work that Jim started and to carry it further. So then I'll do a little self-promotion, because I can't help myself. So I've been working on this book for several years, and many of you who come to the Summer Institute have heard about this. And it's this idea of looking at HBCUs not only as sites of literacy, which was important, but also sites of citizenship, because that's what they were charged with. So in many ways, historically black colleges and universities are distinctly American institutions who are charged with the task of teaching citizenship. So when you wonder why the classics were important, people understand citizenship in a very deep and elemental way. That using the same texts as Wright did, using the Constitution, using Jefferson, using the classics to say, this is what you owe us as citizens. I'm not making it up, I'm using your own texts to show you, was incredibly powerful. And that's sort of what I'm grappling with if this book ever gets finished. The other thing is that when you make HBCUs present, when you count them as part of this larger history, it also changes how we understand the history of higher education, how we understand the history of citizenship. So activism has always been a part of American citizenship. So HBCUs playing that out should be no surprise, because that was their job, was to prepare people for citizenship. But when you actually, and certainly we see this now in the current day, but when you actually engage those ideas, then people are very, very uncomfortable. And the other thing that I think that HBCUs haven't lost, which is so very, very important, is the idea of collective success, a purpose-driven education, that these were to be the uplift of the race. Even though this false argument, or this argument was posed between Du Bois and Washington over classical education or over a vocational education, they both knew that the uplift of the race would come from education. And just to correct the record, that argument started, it predates Du Bois's birth. They were debating this in the 1860s. So it's a really, and I always think, well, are you just giving people who are under-resourced scraps to fight over while you continue to build other institutions and let HBCUs fight over these scraps? But this notion of collective success is one that Cynthia and I have talked about all the time, and that we stress in the Summer Institute, is this idea that it's not about my success individually, but it's about all of our success, that all of us must rise together, right? And I think that that's an important piece that often can't be translated to other institutions, but it says a lot about the strength of HBCUs and how they manage to survive under, challenging and adverse and basically unfair in terms of funding conditions. I'm reading from my notes because I just responded, so I'm sorry if it's not completely linear. So, let me see. All right. When we talk about, and I want to go back to this idea of making HBCUs present and then how it changes the history that we understand, we know that the faculty at HBCUs could not have all been black faculty, right? And it doesn't, and they aren't now. So really, if you think about it, when we're talking about these issues of diversity in faculty and diversity on campus, HBCUs were the first places that had to deal with diversity, right? And managed to survive. The institutions didn't fall apart, and they're still working with those issues and those problems. So I want to leave time for people to ask questions, and so I'm going to close out really quickly. But I just want to say, I cannot emphasize strongly enough how important it is to remember the legacy of HBCUs, to remember the notion of black agency and the way in which we have the power to control our own education, but also how important that is to also be at institutions that are predominantly white. To show that training, to show that excellence, it's that idea of, if you want you're not worried about training your daughters to be good feminists, you're worried about training your sons. So in the same way, it's not just about educating ourselves, it's about educating everyone, which I know is often a heavy burden. But it is really important. And again, the history is going to be overtaken in some ways. So here's the opportunity to take control of that narrative. And I want to end with one story, because I just remembered this. And I saw Jim at AERA, and I told him what had happened. So I've been working on this book, and I said, well, I'd like to do a special edition, because there are all these young scholars who are writing about boards of trustees, student organizations, finances, all of these things about HBCUs. So I said, I approached a major journal in the field, and I said, could we do a special edition on HBCUs? And they said, well, it's not really a field. I've heard something about HBCUs, but they're not really a field. And I would be concerned about calling the quality of the journal into question and alienating the readership. So I was like, thank you, I've only known you for 20 years. I'm gonna give you a pass on this one because I'm sure you didn't mean what you said. So when I was telling Jim at AERA, he's like, they made a big mistake. They don't know what's happening. And so I just wanted to close with that this is a time that's ripe. Let's continue this, and let's build this historiography. And then finally, I just also, and I know you're gonna do the same thing, I wanna thank you for, I won't say how many decades of influence, for me and for my students. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Reese.
Thank you both for your response. We're going to open the floor for questions, but before we do so, I want to take care of some house cleaning rules fairly quickly. We have a mic that will move throughout all of you all. So please, state your name and what institution you represent before asking the question. The second thing is I took the liberty, and Dr. Spence, tell me if I'm overstepping my bounds, to create several hashtags. So all of the questions being asked, all of the pictures being taken, it would be hashtag UNCF Mellon Conference 2017. That's the first one. In response to Stanley Nelson's title, Tell Them We're Rising, hashtag HBCU Still Up. And the last is hashtag HBCU Excellence. And so this is a way that we can present this to the public and help them to understand the kind of conversations that we're having. So at this time, I open the floor to questions.
Raise your hand if you have a question, and then we'll. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Anderson, for this absolutely wonderful presentation this morning. As you pointed out, many of the challenges, but also the wonderful things that HBCUs have done historically, and where these young authors, scholars, perhaps need to go in terms of further research. W.B. Du Bois said, as you know, that alums need to run HBCUs. And then he added, of course, I don't think that's going to happen. Given the fact that there's such turnover in our institutions now, and given the fact that enrollment is very, very low, given the fact that there's so many serious challenges among us, what do you think, or any of the rest of you on the panel, can be that alums can do, this wonderful group of human beings here, to help save HBCUs, if in fact you agree that we're going to be losing some soon if we don't do something? So my question really is about alums. What role can we play, we play, other than meeting on campuses once or twice a year, and et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you for the question. I think a big part of that is the work that you do, and I'll get the mic to you as quickly as possible. But I think Du Bois makes an important point. I guess I'll put it this way. When you go to an HBCU, you take it for granted. It's your experience. It's normal. It's ordinary. It's Stillman. And then when you leave in your professional career, you have so many opportunities to engage high school students. So if I'm in Illinois, Chicago public school system, places like that, I think as alums, we need to make sure that high school students everywhere know the kind of academic and intellectual excellence that we got at HBCUs. Because one of their perceptions is that maybe it's a bit remedial, maybe it's a bit lower tier than white institutions, and we know that is completely wrong and mistaken. And so one of the things that alums can do, in addition to leadership roles, is to really make people aware. And I noticed, and to stop people. When I became dean, they're doing something on me, and they get pictures to write up, and then I saw the title, because I don't pay that much attention to things like that. It says, James D. Anderson, an Illinois original. And my first response was, no, I'm a Stillman College original. And I think that's the thing that we got to make sure that people understand, is that our first baptism into academic and intellectual excellence occurred in places like Stillman and Morehouse and Spelman and Tennessee State and on and on. And to let them know that if they decide to attend these places, they're going to be challenged and they're going to get an outstanding education just as we did. And so I think that's one of the roles that the alums can play. The other one, I think, of course, is that we shouldn't take for granted that the education that we got is there for the taking forever. So the alums need to give back. We need to be active participants. We need to donate. You know, when I first left Stillman, I didn't even think about donating to Stillman College. It wasn't even a thought. And then at some point, my own the freshmen and my own classmates said, look, we got to give to Stillman. Otherwise, Stillman won't be there for future generations. And that, too, has to be really stressed among the alums. It's important that we start as active donors to the HBCUs to send a message to everyone else how much we actually care about them and how much we actually appreciate the education that we got.
Well, and you just stole my thunder with that last point. That was exactly exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think we know that the business model for a lot of HBCUs is dependent upon enrollment. And so if your model is structured as such that most of your revenue is coming from tuition dollars, and when enrollment starts to tank, then inevitably the institution itself is going to start to crumble. And so one of the biggest ways that alumni can contribute is honestly through donations. And I think any size, I think there's also a misconception that, you know, I don't have thousands of dollars to contribute to the institution. I'm just trying to raise my family. I say that as a mother of a 5-year-old, 1-year-old. So, but I think that we have to really, really instill in alum to contribute and donate. I think our giving rates at HBCUs is so much significantly lower than at other institutions. And I think across the board, I mean, I will say I believe Spelman has a fairly high rate of giving, and so it's a pretty good model, but I think it still can be improved. So that is what I would continue to stress for a lot of alum to do, is to just simply to give back, and not just to their own HBCU, quite honestly. Give back to as many institutions as you can, those who are in your local area. I'm in DC, so Howard is down the street. University of Maryland Eastern Shore is also not far, Bowie State, and a number of other institutions in the area.
Good morning. My name is Rosalie Martin. I'm at Huston-Tillotson University in Austin, Texas. I'm currently on sabbatical to do research on Huston-Tillotson. I'll be doing it from the years 1965 to the present. So my question to you is, how do we look at concepts of HBCU being a family and strong relationships building, and how do those concepts relate to student success?
That's actually a really good question, because I think one of the problems in higher ed is the notion that those two concepts are separate. That having a sense of family or community means that you can't be academically excellent. But I think it goes back to what Jim was saying about building peer relations. I'm old school, and I kind of go for some of those mandatory things that bring people together to remind them of the larger purpose of an education, and especially an education at an HBCU. are really important, but I think that you can give value to that idea of community and family. And the other thing that I wanted to add, which ties into the other question, is this idea of legacy, of bringing alumni back, but that alumni are sending their children to the schools that they went to as well, to create that kind of legacy.
I think also we can use various kinds of evidence to build this kind of a case. When I was in Knight versus Alabama case, and after they'd finished with all the expert testimony, and we've been cross-examined 10 ways a Sunday, they decided to bring on the witness stand African-American students who had attended Auburn and University of Alabama, and African-American students who attended Alabama State and Alabama A&M. And the point that you're making in those trial transcripts comes across loud and clear. Even the opposition, even the attorneys for the state of Alabama could not help but wonder, who are these individuals that the students from Alabama State are talking about with reverence? They remembered them, and they knew it wasn't just one person, because they all went back to the same individuals with the same characteristics and what they would do. And then the students came from Alabama and from Auburn, and it was just heartbreaking when they talked about what it was like to be on that campus and what some of the professors said to them and the kinds of relationships they had with peers. And so that sense of community is there in the stories. And we need to do a lot more oral history. I'm sure, you know, he taught me anew the value of doing oral history in his work on Atlanta. But we really do have to do a lot more oral history with various parts of African American history, African American community, but particularly on this question is to talk to students who were there and hear their voices about community and about the sense of family. And I know I remember, if you started to talk to my class at Stillman, we would tell the same stories about the same faculty. And I'll just say one for a second, because he's now president of Wiley College in Haywood Strickland. But when I was at Stillman, he was just out of Wisconsin, young professor, and we were challenging him. And one day he said, "You don't want to take my class," he said. He says, "because I just deal with 3 Ds. I mean, what's that? He said, death, danger, and destruction. So we were like, oh, we're taking it now. You know, he was teaching Civil War and Reconstruction. And if you talk to my class, they have all kinds of stories about how challenging that class was and how we went into the class trying to prove to him that we were just as smart as you. And he would give us challenges and things to read. I know the book that he gave me to read, to report on. It was called The Destruction of the American Democracy, by Nichols, and I didn't know at the time it was a Pulitzer Prize winning book, but he wanted me to read it, and then he'd have us to come to class to make a presentation, have the students to come after you, just see how good you were. And there's so many stories that go to this sense of community. Now, and so the way to get at it is through the oral history, the voices of students who are in these places, and there exists within a lot of trial transcripts where students testified this evidence as well. So you can enlarge that with those kinds of transcripts.
May I get access to those? Getting access to those?
Yeah, you can, because they are public. So the Knight versus Alabama trial transcripts are public. You can order those. Mm-hmm. And if not, I do know the lawyers should have them. Yes.
For the sake of time, I think one more question.
Oh, well, thank you so much, colleagues, for this great discussion. And Dr. Wade, as an archivist, I'm heartbroken to hear any archivist say there's no history on HBCUs. So as the archivist at Spelman, I wanted to ask Dr. Anderson, as well as the panel, what are some of the challenges you might have had doing research on HBCU history, and what can we in the intellectual scholarly community, but also our diverse communities, do to help support research at our own institutions, at HBCUs, and beyond. Thank you.
And I just add that at one point I was part of a project where there was a grant to do inventory of archives at HBCUs, and that was done. But I do want to say that two things. I was saved by Fisk University Archives, and if I had gone to those archives first, I would have written an entirely different book. There's no doubt in my mind. But I had too many chapters written already, which I say to the young scholars, sometimes you got to close it out, you know, even with regret. But you know, the holdings in archives in HBCUs would just rewrite everything. And so I was just in Fisk University Archives, and I would think that something was an interesting footnote to history, only to find out that it was actually the main evidence. And so I would encourage all young scholars, you can go to the Library of Congress, you can go to Harvard Library, you can go to the Journal Education Board files at the Rockefeller, you can go a lot of places and get a lot of information, but there's nothing like the archives in HBCUs.
I didn't mean to hurt your feelings or break your heart. That wasn't my job, and now I'm in trouble with Cynthia. But anyway, what I was saying is, so this book project that I started was looking at the relationship between historically black colleges and northern research institutions, because as you know, you couldn't get an advanced degree at any of the state institutions, and so people came north. States had statutes that allowed that to be part of separate but equal. So through anecdotal evidence, I learned that there were 600 teachers from Virginia who had studied at Teachers College. So I thought I would just look up black teachers. Nothing in our archives. It was coded language for rural education. So what we did was, well, our research assistants went and looked at the admissions records, which were in alphabetical, not chronological order, and then took the names that they found and went back to HBCUs. But how I learned who went to these northern research institutions was in the HBCU archives, looking at faculty records and figuring out who was on leave, then going to that institution and looking that student up. So it is the same thing about where you start. And so I think that it is, I mean, Fisk is amazing, and I have to say Spelman's archives are also amazing as well. I'm going to give a lot of credit in a bunch of different places, and I think when I was doing things have changed since I was doing my research, and certainly since Jim was doing his research, and there being greater access and more emphasis on the archives. But I think it's about, at your institutions, if you can focus on the archives and make them a part of your class and what you're teaching, or to even give them the recognition, that's really important, right? That whole, and I speak as a historian, understanding what happened is so important regardless of what your major may be, even if it started as math. To be able to look back and know that you're not the only one, that you're part of a much larger continuum, which I guess gets at that idea of community as well. It's not just the community here, but this Stillman community that has greater longevity over years.
So in conclusion, in the community in which I grew up, the elders would say, are all hearts and minds clear? With that being said, let's give a round of applause for this very thoughtful conversation.